Cool. Welcome. I want to say thanks everyone for participating in this panel. The goal here is to help share some thoughts and ideas about encouraging diversity in the workplace. And we have like an all-star panel. So I'll let everyone take a minute or two to introduce themselves and talk about their work. And then I'll do some questions, and then I will also we'll take some questions from the chat if folks have their own questions. So let's go ahead and start with Ashleigh.
Sure, thanks, Deb. So hi, everyone. My name is Ashleigh Monagle. It's about 8 o'clock here now in London. It's nice to meet you all. So I work for an organisation called OpenUK, which is an organisation that represents the business of open in the UK. So looking at the 3 opens, so open data, open software and open hardware. And my role is specifically around the digital inclusion agenda and specifically around skills and how we get open technology in the hands of kids who might be disadvantaged.
Excellent. Chassidy, did you want to go next?
Sure. Thanks, Deb. And I'm really happy to be here. My name is Chassidy Cook. I'm a senior principal diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant at Red Hat, the world's enterprise open source leader. I spend most of my time partnering with leaders in our products and technology organization to drive their diversity, equity, and inclusion goals and strategies forward. And I also partner with one of our diversity and inclusion communities, which is Red Hat's version of employee resource groups. It's Hispanic Heritage Month, so I'm really excited to be partnering with Unidos. That's the community that I work with, and also really happy to be here. Thank you.
All right, Radha, you're up.
Thanks, Deb. Hi, everyone. My name is Radha Jhatakia, and I'm a program manager in the Google Open Source Programs Office, and I work on our comms and our DEI initiatives. And I'm working on expanding our DEI offerings and leading some new launches this year, a few of which are partnering with our open source organizations and projects and really helping foster some inclusive environments. So really excited to be speaking on this panel today.
Excellent. So I have a couple questions. I'll just give her an opportunity to answer each one. But if you want to, if you get inspired and you want to add or piggyback onto somebody else's point, that's fine too. We have a whole hour. So I guess let's start with what advice would you give to someone who's just starting out in their DEI work? Maybe Chassidy, do you want to go first?
Sure. I would say 4 different things. I think the first is to engage in active listening and listen to understand. Lots of times, associates or even people out and about when I'm at the grocery store will come up to me. I think I'm one of those people that has that inviting type of personality, but just listening and trying to understand their perspective and where they're coming from, I think is critical to this work. Also, constantly consuming information from a variety of resources, even those that you don't necessarily agree with, is also important. Being confident that you won't always know all of the answers. This work just grows and expands, I think, daily. And so language changes and people shift their views. So things change and you won't always know all the answers, but being confident and being okay with saying, I don't know, but I'm happy to come back to you with an answer. And then finally, and something that I've learned recently is to prioritize my own self-care by being intentional and scheduling that just like I would schedule any other meeting, because I often hear stories that can be heartbreaking sometimes or have to deal through difficult situations. It's important that I carve out that time to make sure that I'm either talking to my therapist or getting a massage or getting a manicure and a pedicure or whatever, binge watching a TV show, whatever self-care means for you, intentionally planning that out, I think is critical to do this work and to stay in it long term.
That's great. I'm going to pass it to Ashleigh.
Thanks, Deb, and thanks for sharing, Chassidy. When you started talking and when the question was asked, in my head, I thought, listen to people and then listen again, basically. Even when some people say stuff, you might not really understand what they say right at the start, but definitely the focus is on people and listening again and trying to figure out what they actually mean. We, about 6-7 months ago, we wrote a letter on belonging and got a sort of 100 tech leaders in the UK to sign up to it, really focused on belonging rather than sort of DEI or what we would call EDI. And we sort of had 4 sort of recommendations that all those tech leaders signed up to. And the first was lead with data. So make sure that you capture metrics, you set targets, and you create accountability for the leaders in your organization. The second thing we talked about was teaching and inspiring leaders, but also trying to create a movement. So you might have 20 or 30 leaders in your organization telling loads of people what to do, but if no one's listening and it's quite a top-down culture, that's not going to work. So yes, you need to focus on leadership, but I think now the rhetoric is changing. How can you create a movement in an organization where people can be courageous and take action when they see something that's wrong or when they need to improve something in themselves? The thing that's really helped us at OpenUK is we are a non-for-profit organisation, and we look to a supportive ecosystem to help us in areas around EDI, and also making sure that we reach the right people who are in need. So that's why for us, building that cohesive ecosystem that has a social impact is really important to us. So those are the things that I would say.
Great. Radha?
Yeah, obviously what Ashleigh and Chassidy have mentioned, and to add on to that, one is to build a safe space wherever you're working on DEI practices, both for allyship in terms of allowing people to unlearn behaviors and ask questions to create safe space dialogue, but also to provide people with different backgrounds and different communities a space to talk about things that affect them, whether or not everyone in the workplace is facing that challenge. Outside incidents can affect people in that workplace, and creating safe spaces for both situations allows people to really have bring their whole selves into the workplace. And the next part for ourselves as DEI practitioners is to really practice resilience. DEI is a wonderful initiative to launch and to really be passionate about, but it can often be very taxing work. And so, as Chassidy mentioned about having some sort of self-care routine, also making sure that when you hear complaints, when you're hearing things that might not be in alignment with what you believe or how you want to launch some sort of DEI initiative, making sure you're just practicing that resilience for yourself and your own well-being.
A lot of great points. So this kind of leads into especially the self-care and the resilience. But I was wondering if you could each of you could talk about how your approach to DEI or EDI work has changed during the pandemic. Maybe we'll mix it up. I'll go to Ashleigh first this time.
Thanks, Deb. So the pandemic definitely had a massive impact on the work that we deliver. So for those of you that don't know, every year we run a kids camp, which is a program. This year we've got, inspired by the Mini Mew musical glove kit to teach young children how to use open technology and also be a bit fun and creative about it with some music. And we had to take everything online during the pandemic. So all the learning was virtual through an online learning platform, complete learning experience for everyone. And we'd never done something like that before. And some of the challenges that we faced originally was when you have the kids glove, you used to have to sew it up. And for some children that didn't have a mentor there to support them with sewing or even with the course was really, really difficult. And I think when you're learning new things as well as a child, it's really useful to have that mentorship and to have those teachers there to be able to support you. And that was a lot more difficult going virtual. But on the positive side, what we did realize is that more people were being able to be more engaged and reached online as well. So we weren't just targeting, middle class classrooms. of people with enough money to do the course, because it was virtual, it was online, and people could reach it. It meant that we could expand our reach to people that actually needed this learning, and could find something fun to do whilst they were sort of stuck at home and not being at school.
Yeah. Yeah, everything virtual. Chassidy, did you want to comment on how your work has changed? Your approach to your work has changed?
Sure. So, I mean, outside of the obvious working from home and being virtual, that actually turned out to be very positive for me, and being able to connect with a lot more associates at Red Hat. I'm someone that attends a ton of meetings every single day. And when I was in the office, there were times sitting in meetings, but also that time that you go from different meeting room to different meeting room. But now that I'm at home, I found it easier to connect with more associates and identify their needs and try to figure out how we can elevate their needs into either a program or a component of our strategy. Something that is key to my work is centering the most marginalized associate. And it's actually become a bit easier to identify who the most marginalized is in different situations, because we're all remote now and we work virtually. Whereas it would have taken months and months for me to have a conversation with someone who may be in India, just because I had to wade through those in-person conversations first. Now I can meet anyone at any time. It's not my favorite thing to wake up at 3 or 5 o'clock a.m. to have a meeting, but I'm definitely willing to do it if it's going to help us drive our DEI initiatives forward. So for me, it's been more of an equalizer. I think another example, or an example of this, is that when I would meet someone, I wouldn't always know that they were necessarily a caregiver. But when they went home and I could hear or see their little ones or their parent in the background, it added that dimension to them, or it just added additional context to who that person was. And I think it's that empathy building that's also critical for this work. So for me, it's been kind of positive. There are definitely some negatives. I missed that in-person connection, but I think work-wise, it's definitely improved in a positive way.
Yeah, the empathy, that's such a big one. Radha?
So I think for us, the pandemic actually helped us reach more of our audiences. Prior to the pandemic, a lot of our DEI work was done through events, being able to sponsor different sessions, bring in facilitators, have discussions. And I actually think that was really valuable, because that in-person connection is invaluable. You can't recreate that through a computer. But I think the reach has really expanded now that we're able to do things virtually. And so a lot of our initiatives over the last year that we've launched actually have partially been because we're all remote now. Some things have been our inclusive language initiatives, starting to do more workshops that folks from international time zones can connect to. And like Chassidy, it's not fun when you're waking up at 5 a.m. to do those, but when you're able to reach folks across so many different time zones, it actually makes it really worth it, because your impact is going so much further. And so while there's both pros and cons to shifting to virtual, I think the reach has really been beneficial to been able to expand that work.
Yeah, the self-care is coming more into focus when I'm hearing about all these 5 a.m. meetings. Yeah, I see that. Let's see. One of the, I think Chassidy mentioned, there's a lot to read about doing DEI work online all the time, and you can always be learning. I imagine many of us also follow other kinds of diversity activists on Twitter or other social media to kind of keep up to date with things. So sometimes you get this very general advice or a tactic, or somebody's like, this was amazing, this worked so awesome at my place. Can you tell about a time that you took some really general advice, and then how you kind of figured out how to apply it in your communities? Because I feel like there's a lot of really general advice, and sometimes it can be well, we don't have boats, so what are we going to do? And so I think that would really help other practitioners kind of think about how you approach that problem. And Radha, you haven't started yet, so I'm going to go to you first.
Happy to. So we talked a little bit about, reading materials or participating in dialogues that aren't really part of our core work. And so part of my background is actually from higher ed. And so when I was in that space, a lot of the work was social justice topics, DEI topics, talking to students about those things. And I think since then, being in that space and just being in those social justice circles, you're able to learn more about things, maybe language changes that come up, new topics that come up. And so there's a constant level of education that you're able to pull and grasp from and be able to apply to your own work. And so some of the things that we do now is, research topics on a daily basis, whether, it's a scholarly article or it's something that's come out from Forbes, but around a general social justice topic. And then I take that with, a facilitator on my team, and then we apply it to open source. How is this concept related to open source? Just to make it more relatable to the audience, make it something that people are dealing with directly in their day-to-day lives, and then make it more consumable for them. So if it's about gender, if it's about race, something that's going on in the real world, how is that affecting your open source community, and why should you care about it? And so it's just a concept that, we've taken from our approaches when we were in higher ed working with students, and now instead it's our own peers, it's our colleagues and our community members.
Great. Great. Chassidy, did you want to follow up on that?
Sure. So I think something that I kind of take, some general advice that I've taken is actually from my mom. She's a nurse and has worked in a bunch of different medical fields. And something that has remained consistent for her is that you always focus on the person that needs the most help. So if there's a large incident, the person that is in the worst shape, you go and you try to support that person first. And that's really where the thinking about centering the most marginalized comes from, is that if we focus on whomever is the most marginalized and we solve DEI for them, or we increase belonging for them, we're likely to increase belonging for everyone else who's not as marginalized. A real world example of this is, I used to work for another organization, and there was someone on my team who had ADHD. And we would have these day-long workshops where we would sit and do really intensive work and try to come up with a new project or product or something like that. And that person, because of their ADHD, had a really difficult time sitting through those meetings and being able to contribute in a really meaningful way to the project, but also in a way that made them feel good about their work. And so we thought, and I asked, hey, what do you need for this meeting? And they started to explain they need a break after about an hour and a half to 2 hours, maybe 15 minutes long. Lunch can be an hour. And so I'm like, okay, let's give it a try. We gave it a try, and productivity increased for that person, and they made amazing contributions, but it did for everyone else there. And when I was honest with myself, I didn't want to sit there for 4 hours and then go to lunch and come back for an additional 4 hours. So that's an example of what happens when you center the most marginalized. Productivity increases, they felt more included, and so our innovation increased. And so I think just staying true to that concept that I pulled from my mom's work in the medical field has really helped out a lot.
Oh, that's great and so specific. Ashleigh, did you want to talk about taking general advice and using it in your work?
Yeah, thank you. I'm definitely seeing connections with what sort of everyone's saying. I can see us all kind of nodding at each other, which is really, really great. So a couple of things, and I suppose they've kind of tripled off of each other, is my background is in innovation and design thinking. So that whole idea of putting the user at the heart of what you do. So at the start, we were all talking about, listen to people and listen again. And I've used those methodologies around design thinking to really help us understand how we ensure the most deprived people get access to what they actually need. And that's what led us to change the terminology from EDI to belonging. And we tried to tweak that for the community because of the challenges that we were seeing around neurodiversity within the open community. And people, rhetoric and language is so important. And the last thing that we want to do is create another term for people to try and get to grips with. So I think it was a challenging decision to try and change from DEI to EDI to belonging, but we made a real commitment to that terminology to support a complete mix, a really mixed community that's really neurodiverse, to ensure that we can achieve the best results together. So it was about making people belong, but also saying, wow, look what we can achieve by bringing that type of community together.
Awesome. I have one more question, and I could ask another one, but if folks from the audience want to ask questions or something, then we would love to hear from you. I'm curious, so, you know, I feel like when I started in technology, like there was like, you would talk about diversity and they'd be like, oh, we have one person under 30. And it was like, ooh, we're not, yeah, we're not really talking about diversity yet. So, but like along the way, people have tried a lot of things, especially some of the things in a corporate setting. I've noticed that sometimes, not speaking about any of the companies represented here, but like companies will take on like a diversity tactic, basically to kind of hedge their bets if they get sued, which doesn't have the best result. But they're like, as we're kind of trying to like offer advice for folks who might be following in you all's footsteps, what's something that you've seen that people like to try but doesn't really work very well that maybe we can help other folks avoid? Radha, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, actually, while you were talking, some ideas just popped into mind. But I think an issue that we face in tech and even in open source, right, is a lack of gender and racial representation. And so when it comes to recruiting practices, I think in an effort to create diversity, that's one of the recruiting practices. Let's go to different college campuses. Let's go to different places where we can get diverse recruitment. The problem is the retention piece, the inclusion piece. When you actually have folks from these different walks of life, these different backgrounds, these different communities come into your workplace, they don't feel included because the culture that is represented there for when we ask about, oh, are they part of this culture fit, has been already established by the majority representation that is there. And that majority representation is not one that they fit into or actually should belong and be part of. Culture should be established by everyone that is there. And so I think one of the practices that, you know, we as DEI practitioners or, you know, just all companies in general need to be better about is creating a sense of inclusion and belonging through active practices. So basically that's, you know, really listening to your employees on what would make them feel welcome, actually creating an improved sense of culture to foster a sense of foster an environment that includes everyone, creating more seats at the table, creating opportunities for people to voice their opinions, creating recognition opportunities, and creating an environment that everyone feels comfortable in. So I think retention is really the key piece that we should be focusing on, but is often forgotten.
Oh, that's great. Ashleigh, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, as you were both talking, I'm sort of writing down more points. I think we're kind of going off of each other a little bit. So the first thing that's really popular is I've hired a diversity manager. So tick the box, all my diversity problems are solved, right? And then the second one is, oh, we're going to do stuff on recruitment. So, you know, we're going to put our CVs into a funky tool and it's going to tell us if there's any gender specific terms in there. You know, that's the basic stuff. And that's really the low hanging fruit. I think the culture is a big thing that needs to be sorted. Another thing that I think people don't look at enough is people's like socioeconomic status. So I might look the same as someone else that's sort of white, female, sounds like I do, right? But we might have completely different backgrounds and you have no idea what that is. And I think people don't consider that as much as they probably should. They, you know, you see things as surface level two people come into the office and they look really, you know, shiny suits. One could be paying that all off on credit cards, and one could actually be really, really rich. So it's getting that little bit deeper into diversity. I also think what we're missing and what we probably need to do more about is building that financial case of value in terms of what diversity of thought can bring to businesses. And I think that's probably what more organizations need to do. At the end of the day, the CEO or the CFO want to look at numbers, and they've got a business to run. You know, we're all trying to achieve social outcomes, but we really need to be able to build that financial case and really show why a diversity of thought matters. Another sort of two things that I would sort of suggest to support people is around succession planning. So that's a really key one that organizations should be doing, and something that I've taken part of before, which is quite fun, which is reverse mentoring. So mentoring really people, senior people on the board with graduates. And it was a great way to get people of that level to think differently. Who, you know, if you've been in the organization for 20 or 30 years, there might be some resistance to change, and that was quite useful.
Lots of ideas. That's so great. Chassidy, I'd love to hear from you too.
Sure. Everything that Radha and Ashleigh have said has been amazing, and I completely agree. I think when you look internally, I think that should be the place to start, is inside of your organization first, and really focusing on inclusion. And there's some concrete actions that you can take, such as examining the procedures, policies, and practices and assessing them to ensure that they're actually inclusive. Do you have to speak at certain conferences in order to be promoted at a certain level? And if so, what resources is the workplace providing all associates so that they can have those opportunities? If they're not providing those resources, well, then that means that those that have more leisure time have access or opportunities to participate more. Or if you are a single mom and you have 3 children, you probably don't have the same amount of time as another woman that works at your organization that may be single and earlier in her career. She might have more time. And so that puts her at an advantage, especially when organizations have these requirements built into promotion structures and things like that. It also goes to succession planning. As Ashleigh talked about, can you look at your organization and see who is up and coming, who has the drive, who really wants to move up in their career, and what sort of resources are you providing them? At Red Hat, we have a sponsorship program where we have senior leaders that are partnered with associates from historically marginalized communities, and they're helping them to intentionally build their careers. It's a 1-year program, and we hope that those relationships extend beyond 1 year, as sponsorships normally do. But that's one way that we're intentionally trying to rectify what we see as a disparity in our organization. Another way is to provide true allyship training to leaders and associates within an organization. Allyship is not just saying, oh, I support your community. It's actually, as Radha mentioned earlier, unlearning behaviors and then relearning really important tools and resources, how to advocate for others who are not like you, and how to stand and hold space. Or sometimes it's knowing when you need to sit down and elevate someone else from that particular community. And then externally as well, there are some companies who have donated tons of money to certain organizations or certain historically Black colleges and universities. And the thought is great, but because they didn't have those really important conversations to begin with about what the schools actually need, which oftentimes is building the infrastructure so that students don't have to focus so much on their outside job, but that maybe you give them scholarships and they can focus on their school. Or do they have internet access? Is it reliable? Instead of just throwing money out there, have those conversations and find out what the needs are, and then donate money in a really meaningful way so that you're actually building a talent pathway versus just trying to build that relationship so that you can increase diversity in your organization. So that's what I would add.
Awesome. So many great suggestions in there. It's and I appreciate that everyone was nice and didn't share any horrible stories of other orgs, like kind of airlifting, you know, not great ideas. There's plenty of those. Maybe this is not the place, and that's okay. We had a question from the chat. Brian wanted to know if forced diversity is a good thing. Like, you know, that is, that's a kind of a simple question, but I think it has a couple of different ideas tucked in there that maybe, like, by the time you get to that place, you've already missed a few stops. But yeah, maybe, I don't know, Ashleigh, if you would want to speak to that, or I can open it up and anyone can kind of like buzz in, like Jeopardy or whatever.
I mean, it's definitely a topic of debate. So I'm really interested into what everyone has to say. And to be honest, I'm in two minds, and I think it depends on the situation, really. I think it's sad if that's what it has to come to, but sometimes a bit of force is needed. You know, if you want people to be able to look up and see others in the organization that they could potentially look to in the future, and they look, oh, look at that female CEO, that's what I want to be. You know, you kind of need those role models in place. I also think sometimes, you know, people are driven by metrics, KPIs to have to do something. And maybe if we had them, people would push that a little bit further. It's not saying that you always have to be 100%, or, you know, you always have to be getting 50% female hires, 50% male hires, all of that kind of stuff, just as an example. But, you know, if you're pushing yourself, it's not like you're trying to reach that target, but every single time you do something around diversity and inclusion, you're asking yourself, am I doing enough? And I think that's the real question that the metrics ask is, am I doing enough? And no one's expecting it to get to 100% right away. But if you're pushing yourself to ask those questions in a meaningful way, that's what's going to make the difference.
That's great. I see Chassidy's been nodding. Did you want to add to that?
Sure. So I think it's a bit challenging, and I wonder if it's just like vocabulary terminology here. But just to clarify, diversity is a fact. It just exists. And so I think what we're really talking about here is inclusion and belonging. And I think I struggle with the word forced. I would prefer to focus on intentionality and just say that there were systems and structures that were built to intentionally exclude and disenfranchise others. And so if we're going to make it right, we have to be intentional as well, with breaking down those barriers, with opening up the doors to include everyone else. And so again, I struggle with forced. I'm much more on board with intentionality and making efforts to change things for the better.
Great. Radha, did you want to comment as well?
Yeah, I would say to take a look also at why you're at a place where you now need to quote unquote force this diversity. As Chassidy mentioned, right, the intentionality piece there. So what led to this being an undiverse workplace? And the reason I would be against forced diversity is because you don't want to, in order to check off a box or to have some sort of artificial inclusion, then put people into an environment that they do not feel welcome in. And so I think the first step there is to actually take a look at the organization or the culture and see what has led to the lack of inclusion there and address that first. And by addressing that, you'll eventually have more of a diverse setting, more of an inclusive group. But I'm not a proponent of forced diversity in order to check off the box, because that puts a lot of people in really uncomfortable situations.
And I think it goes back to your point about the retention, like how long is someone going to stay if they find out the day after they arrive that they were the forced diversity hire? It's no one's going to stick around for that. We have a couple of other thoughts and questions in the chat. I had not exactly a question. Monica offered that it's frustrating that so many people just assume anyone from a marginalized group is automatically less deserving. And I think that goes to what you were saying, Radha, about the culture being like sort of having some issues before you get to the point of like the idea of the forced diversity hire. And then someone else asked, and anyone, you can, all of you can comment on whichever parts of this you would like. Someone else asked, what's your top suggestion for better in-person events? Because a lot of typical meetups and conferences, even team building activities are a nightmare, but they still dominate what counts for networking and participation. And so I'll sort of open that up. Chassidy, do you want to start?
Sure. I often defer to trying to figure out what the audience wants and needs, and build an event around that. I noticed when we were having in-person events that they would be large and it would be a mix of folks from different levels. And sometimes that's great, but other times it's valuable to break out your early talent group and let them have conversations with senior leadership and ask those important questions. And maybe it's a time where that early talent group needs to meet with someone that's just at that next level to help them get to their career. So I always say to find out what the audience wants. Offer ways for them to engage so that it's not just lecture style, sitting and listening. I mean, sometimes that's appropriate, but oftentimes I think engaging and interacting adds value. And it also speaks to the different ways that different people learn. And so I'm not huge on the event planning. That is not my role. But when I was doing that for a very short amount of time, because there's so many people who are so much better at it, I really just asked folks, what do you need? What do you want to get out of this? And most of the time we had a really successful event following that.
Excellent. Ashleigh, I know you have a lot of experience with events. Do you want to comment on how to improve that and improve diversity within those settings?
Yeah, so when you mentioned events, one thing always sticks in my head around diversity, and it was actually an event that I went to, all revolved around storytelling and everyone's own personal stories around when they felt excluded or discriminated against. And what was really powerful about that event was that it was all personal stories told from people within the business that you knew, and also people that you respected in the business, to the point where our CFO, this is at an old organization I used to work at, she was actually really, really upset and couldn't talk anymore. For someone who was quite, spoke quite a lot, presented quite a lot, I think everyone was quite upset by what was going on. And just hearing everyone's personal stories, couldn't believe people had gone through that. But then to see our CFO sort of lost for words, I think made everyone else realize kind of what was going on. So that personal story, that emotion and that storytelling really makes a difference. And if you have presenters who are really vulnerable and willing to share that, that can be a really, really powerful thing for your audience. And then in terms of sort of general team building activities, networking and participation, I think it's all about creating that awareness right from the start, and saying, you know, if you're part of a team, look around you, look at the quiet people, look at the loud people, look at the people who might be uncomfortable. How can you bring people together? So it's about having those facilitators that can make that happen. And I also think we're moving into a strange time at the moment, which is interesting to explore around hybrid events. So, you know, you think you have 10 people in a meeting, 5 are on a laptop and 5 are in the room. Some of the most important conversations and opportunities can happen on the walk to the meeting or away from the meeting. And if people are stuck at home for whatever reason, you know, childcare, live too far away from the city, things like that, how can you make sure that those people that are virtually in a meeting have the same opportunities as those who are there in person? So that's probably a question for the rest of you guys, but I'll let Radha go for the next question.
You're up. Radha?
Something that I was thinking about, because my background is actually partially in events as well. I worked on the Grace Hoffer conference, and now I'm leading up some of the DEI events that we do at our conferences here. And one thing that I've always focused on is who I'm bringing in as a speaker, or how we're facilitating the dialogue in the workshops or the sessions that we're having. If it's a small group session or smaller workshop, really being able to, again, one, fosters a safe space conversation so that people are able to open up, connect with one another, bringing in a facilitator who is really knowledgeable and passionate about the subject so that they're able to have those conversations, and bringing in speakers who are both inspiring and also able to connect with the audience and the attendees, and be able to share their experiences and answer questions. So I think all of those are important aspects to creating an event where there's a lot of conversational dialogue going on, and it's not just generic icebreakers that you're offering, or no facilitation of the event.
Yeah, that's great. Events are so hard, and the hybrid is going to be a huge challenge. Ashleigh's comment made me think, if there are questions that you all would like to hear from each other on. We're kind of at our last 15 minutes here, and this would be a great time if there's something that you're like, oh, this is a challenge that I'm looking at or trying to figure out how I'm going to grapple with, or something that will eventually, might be on your like, ugh, 2022, I'm going to have to look at this. If you want to ask each other, I think that would be great. This one again is like the Jeopardy, I won't call on you.
I kind of really want to know what your guys' advice is around those kind of hybrid events, and how you can ensure that people get the same opportunities. I think that's it's a hard topic, and it's a hard nut to crack, and it's quite a new challenge. So it'd be great to hear your thoughts on that.
I can start. We're also relatively new to the hybrid event space, but some of the things that I've learned in launching a couple this year is, if you're able to offer recordings of the sessions and then be able to have like a chat room afterwards, where you're able to engage with both maybe the audience members who are in person for the conference watching the video, and also who have attended the session virtually, there is some conversation that happens there. That way it's not just the virtual attendees logging on, it's also the in-person attendees who may have had a different experience in the room being able to share something. That's been a better facilitation of a Q&A than just doing something in person or just doing it online. And another way is, instead of pre-recording all of the sessions, trying to work with the conference organizers to do a live session, kind of like what we're doing now, where there is a chat session that's open, so that even attendees who have chosen to go to the conference in person are able to perhaps go to one conference room, watch the session happening, but be able to submit like real-time questions into the chat. So I think those are the two options that I've attempted this year, and both have created more engagement than a simple standalone session that's pre-recorded and then there's no interaction afterwards.
So again, with a caveat that I don't do very many events, some of the things that we do have going on at Red Hat is we've started to source questions in advance, just to allow us time to prepare, but also to make sure that we're opening up the window for everyone to think about the session, understand what it's about, and ask any questions that they have. Something that we've done for more meeting style activities, where a manager might be having a meeting with their employees, and like you said, Ashleigh, 5 are in the room and 5 are virtual, is we've prepared these enablement guides for managers after, that have questions that managers can ask to ensure that their associates understood the information that was shared, that they can ask follow-up questions if it ties to development, or if it was about the team structure changing. There's an enablement guide that can help them to have those conversations, and it's designed to use after that meeting so that everyone's conversation is after the meeting. I think the sad part about it is that as long as hybrid events or meetings are occurring, it's always going to be a risk of having that on the way to the meeting room conversation with your manager or with a leader. I don't know how we'll be able to get around that, but I do think what Radha shared and then maybe some enablement after meetings might help with that.
Yeah, I wonder, like, kind of related to the meeting thing and a little bit more in your wheelhouse, Chassidy, like, thinking about not just like the large group meetings, but like how do we facilitate in this environment going forward? I mean, it's like mentoring opportunities. Like, how can we do a better job of providing those in this weird sort of hybrid environment?
Yeah, I think as many tools as you can provide, so guiding questions for the mentor or the sponsor, I believe that if you're a sponsor and that's someone that is more actively engaging in someone's career, you kick off that relationship and you plan the first few meetings. You help that person that you're sponsoring feel comfortable with this new relationship. But if you're a mentor, oftentimes mentees are responsible for that. But preparing in advance, having these guiding questions, it can be a little awkward, I think, meeting someone new for the first time and it's just the two of you on a virtual call. So as much as you can kind of plan that conversation, but not too much where you can't kind of go and just follow the path naturally and organically, I think is very helpful. And then after as well, like sometimes you'll maybe meet a senior leader and it was a really great conversation and you're just stuck and you don't know what to do afterwards. But I think having some follow-up, taking notes during that, and then sending a nice email or scheduling the next meeting in advance, just going and having a plan has been really helpful. And as leaders in an organization, I think we can build and provide those tools for associates to kind of equalize what's going on as much as possible.
I love that. The plan for how to like be mentored yeah, that's amazing. Radha, did you want to talk about mentoring in the new weird place that we all lived?
I think we have some pretty great programs that focus on mentoring for open source through Google. If anyone has ever heard of Google Summer of Code, they have always practiced in a virtual environment. The organizations are all international, the participants are international, everything happens within a digital and virtual format. So I think in terms of mentorship on like the open source end, because those programs have always run that way, there wasn't really a change to any of those. But in terms of in-person mentorship, I think the nature of meeting my mentor over coffee in person in the office has definitely changed to where we would do maybe coffee chats while we were at home. But eventually the busyness of working from home, and I'm sure others have felt this as well, where you're now maybe working longer, maybe there are days when you're not feeling as productive, but somehow the days end up a little bit longer. And those coffee meetings and those meetings that you maybe need for that one-on-one connection and building that relationship with your colleagues have kind of dropped off. So I think you have to be very intentional when you're working from home or a remote environment about building up those relationships.
That's great. Actually, I hope that speaks to some of what you were hoping to get at. I've noticed that you've also been sharing all these amazing resources. I don't know if folks want to share any other resources, some of their like best follows on social media for DEI practitioners or anything like that. And we could kind of close up with that and maybe some thoughts on what you're, looking at in 2022, like as far as, where you're going next. Ashleigh, go ahead.
Yeah. So what you guys were saying was prompting me to put stuff in the chat, but it's also kind of what I'm thinking about for the future. So when we talked about OpenUK at the start, I was telling you about the musical glove kit, really focused on STEM, but changing it to STEAM, so the inclusion of the arts. You guys spoke earlier about being able to have resilience, which, because sometimes these topics are quite difficult for people and quite challenging and can make people quite uncomfortable. So this idea of bringing in the arts and bringing this idea of play into it and into the workplace, I think is really important and can make things seem a lot more lighthearted and also engaging. So one of the resources that I put in the chat is this game from the BBC, and it's called the Ally Track. And it basically helps you understand your privilege compared to other people. And they've got loads of different other resources like that. So I definitely think 2022 is about play, engagement, and almost like the gamification of things as well. You know, if more people are online, how can we make sure that we bring it to the forefront of them and get them to take attention, really? And that's probably a good challenge for people in the open source community who have the power to create awesome diversity tools like this.
Well, Radha, some closing thoughts, and then we'll go to Chassidy, and I think we're about out of time.
Yeah, I appreciate being here today, and just I think a big portion of my learning actually comes from reading more so than social media. So I think the last book that we are reading for just our social justice book club book is How to Talk About Race. And so, you know, I think there's a lot of material out there. It really depends on how you best consume the information, whether that's through reading it, whether it's through podcasts, whether it's through shorter articles, watching videos. There's a lot of material on YouTube as well. If you're unfamiliar with a topic, you can just search it and there will be a variety of informational videos. Brene Brown is one of my favorites. Kimberly Crenshaw videos are great. So I think there's so much information out there for everyone to learn from.
So I was a little distracted by some of the resources that you mentioned, Radha, because I follow some of those folks on social media. I am on social media, probably too much. But again, Kimberly Crenshaw, Tarana Burke, Ijeoma Oluo, Layla Saad, who I think authors the book that Radha mentioned. And gosh, Rachel Cargill is amazing and has this, it's like a coursework that she's built, and it's called The Great Unlearn, and it's just phenomenal. So I follow her as well. Next year, still focusing on building out a DEI strategy. I think that every Red Hat associate can engage in really building out what an inclusive associate journey looks like. And then also working through trying to navigate social justice outside of work and what happens when that comes inside of the workplace, and how we can still do some of that work that's meaningful for our employees, but not go too far into the, this is work. So we're not going to, go outside of that workspace, but what does social justice look like in the workspace, and how we can continue to do that meaningful work inside of Red Hat. So that's what we'll be focusing on next year.
Fantastic. If you want to drop any other links in the chat for folks that are still here, a lot has been written down and folks have pulled things that have been mentioned and typed them up. So that is fantastic. I just want to say, again, thank you to all three of you for agreeing to participate in this panel and really looking at it from the practitioner's perspective and what is, doable in the workplace. And I think that was really, really helpful. I think based on the chat, I think we got everybody riled up in there too. So I think it was a really engaging session. So thank you so much. Oh, we're getting little claps in the place. So that means I think we're done. Thank you.